Okay, so we're going to get started. We're going to hear first from Abradeep, and then in person, and then Evgenia, Avinandan, Robel, Abu Bakr, and then Kritika will be taking us home. So 10 minutes for presentations. We should have a minute, time for a question, and then keep going with this lightning session for the international section job market paper session. Oof. So thank you very much for your participation. And without further ado, Abradeep. That's great.
Should I get started? Good afternoon, everyone. I am Abradeep Karmakar. I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of Economics, University of New Mexico, and my job market paper is titled as Right to Education and Children's Human Capital, Experimental Evidence from Andhra Pradesh, India. And this is a joint work with my dissertation advisor, Professor Kira Villa. And the objective of our work is to evaluate the impact of this act on children's health and cognition in Andhra Pradesh. Andhra Pradesh is one particular state in India. The Right to Education Act is a large school-based economic reform that has a large number of important mandates, but the primary mandates are that all government and government-aided schools should provide free and compulsory education to all children aged 6 to 14 years in government and government-aided schools. There should be infrastructural improvements at schools like separate toilets for boys and girls, safe drinking water facilities, better playgrounds, better kitchen sheds. The act also mandates the reservation of 25% of the admission seats in private schools for children belonging to economically disadvantaged groups or underrepresented groups of the society. And also the Right to Education Act was implemented nationally in April 2010, but states were allowed to make amendments to the guidelines. This led to different states adopting it in different years, and Andhra Pradesh adopted it in February 2009. Most of existing RTE 2009 literature focus on education outcomes and report heterogeneous increases in school attendance, decline in math and reading scores, decline in grade reputations, and we add to this literature by looking at both health and education outcomes. So education outcomes have been studied. We study both health and education outcomes in one Indian state. We use data from the Young Life Surveys in India, which is a longitudinal study of childhood poverty in 4 low-income countries: India, Ethiopia, Peru, and Vietnam. In India, the wireless followed 3,000 children in 2 different cohorts across 7 districts in Andhra Pradesh. 2,000 of these children were born between 2001 and 2002, and they are the younger or young cohort. And 1,000 of these children were born between 1994 and 5, and they are the older or old cohort. And we use data for, we use 5 rounds of the wireless data in 2002, 6, 9, 13, and 16. The wireless present a huge set of information on individual factors, community, schooling, health, anthropometric cognition, time use, and a host of other factors. This is a diagrammatic representation of how the wireless is conducted. The younger cohort is aged 1, 5, 8, 12, and 15 in the rounds 2, 6, 9, 13, and 16. And the older cohort is aged 8, 12, 15, 19, and 22 in the same rounds. In this analysis, we just focus on children aged 8, 12, and 15 because these age groups, 1, 5, 9, and 22, are not part of the formal schooling years in India. The blue line, which is here, shows the implementation of this act in Andhra Pradesh. So the young cohort is exposed to this act at 12 and 15 years, but the older cohort is not exposed. So the younger cohort becomes our treatment group, the older cohort becomes our control group. We use age 8 as the pre-treatment period because the younger cohort is not exposed to this act at any of the ages. So age 8 is the pre-treatment period, and ages 12 and 15 are our post-treatment period. And based on these two naturally occurring differences, we adopt the difference in differences strategy. But before that, to summarize our primary human capital outcomes, we use body mass index Z-score, which is the standard deviation difference between the BMI of a child and the median BMI of children in the same age group. And we find positive and significant differences after our P2009. And for education outcomes, we use PTVT test scores and math test scores. And after our P2009, we find negative differences between the treatment cohort and control cohort. So this is our difference in differences equation, where on the right-hand side of the equation, we have the time indicator, ages 12 and 15, or age 8. The treatment indicator, young or old cohort, and then we are interacting post and young to get our treatment effect coefficient for the younger cohort. So phi is giving us the outcome differences between the younger and old cohort after our P2009 was implemented. And then we have a vector of baseline housing controls and community fixed effects. We evaluate the robustness of our DD findings by doing an event study design, where we interact each age group, 8, 12, and 15 with the treatment indicator. So age 8 is the pre-treatment period. It is omitted from the equation, and we are left with young, age 12, the interaction between young and age 12, age 15, and then the interaction between them. From this equation, we can get the outcome differences between the treatment and control groups. At age 8, this equals rho. At age 12, this equals rho plus delta 12. And then at age 15, this equals rho plus delta 15. Moving into the results section, these are the DD estimates for health. Columns 1, 2, and 3 present estimates for BMI-Z for the pool models. Column 4 and 5 for boys and girls. And then in column 6, we present an alternative health estimate, which is height for each Z-score. The treatment effect coefficient is positive, is statistically significant, and is also consistent in magnitude. So this tells us that as a result of sustaining exposure to our P2009, the younger cohort reports significantly larger BMI-Z as compared to the older cohort. The estimates for boys are similar in nature, despite differing in magnitude. And for girls, we find positive effect, but it is not statistically significant. For height for age Z-score, the effect is positive and not significant as well. The cognition estimates present a different scenario. The treatment effect for the two estimates are negative, and most of the estimates are not statistically significant. So while we find positive treatment, while we find negative effects, estimates are insignificant, which are similar to existing literature. The robustness findings are presented in this table. This is the difference at age 8. It is not significant. At age 12, it improves significantly. And at age 15, it improves further and is highly significant in nature. And the cognition effects are not significant as well. So the marginal effects for boys and girls are presented in this slide. The green bars are for boys, the orange bars for girls. And we find that the estimates for boys are larger than the estimates for girls. And for both gender, the estimates at the ages of 12 and 15 are larger than the difference at age 8. And also before Article 2009 was implemented, the differences are not statistically significant. The cognition results, similar to the DD estimates present a different scenario. We find that for girls, the difference at the post-treatment periods are larger than the pre-treatment differences. And for boys, we find the opposite thing, that the differences in the post-treatment periods are smaller than the pre-treatment differences. So to conclude, we show improvements in children's BMI-Z, RT 2009, where both boys and girls, where estimates for both boys and girls show equal beneficial impact, they show declines in cognition outcomes. Based on existing literature, one of the major reasons for this is that as a result of this act, the process of gaining admission in schools has become very easy. This is causing a crowding in at schools, and hence the quality of education is going down. And in this context, we suggest amendments within the RT 2009 mandates for making scholarships or rewards available to improve the learning achievements of students. So this is the end of my presentation. So that is a very good question. So this act was implemented in 2011 in Andhra Pradesh. As a result of this act, children's enrollment or participation at schools have improved, and that is leading to an increase in their exposure to other pre-existing or concurrent development programs. For example, there was a midday meal school meal program in India that started in 1995, I think. And since children are participating more at schools as a result of this act, their exposure to the other programs are hence that is causing an improvement in their. So we haven't tried that. Yeah, food consumption is something that we need to check. Great job. Thank you.
Is this your phone? Okay, we're gonna go to Zoom. Evgenia is next.
Hi, it says I cannot share my screen because I'm not allowed.
I will fix that. You should have the power now.
And can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, and can you see my screen?
We can.
Okay, perfect.
You're all set. I'll put in the chat
Thank you.
when your time is running.
Thank you. So my name is Evgenia. I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of Agricultural, Food and Resource Economics at Michigan State University. My dissertation revolves around the issues of causes and consequences of youth migration in Tanzania. And in this paper in particular, we are looking at the consequences for the non-migrant household members who stay in the origin. We define youth as people of age from 15 to 34, and they are the most mobile group of people moving for various different reasons. And yet, youth migration is a prominent phenomenon in Africa. There is still little evidence on what impacts it has on the livelihood of non-migrant household members. There is a vast literature on the outmigration of youth and adults in Asia and in South America, but in Africa, people usually focus on the outmigration of men and on the welfare of their non-migrant wives and children. There is a recent paper by Valerie Mueller and co-authors that studied the outmigration of the children of household head and its impact on the non-migrant parents and siblings of the migrant. So what does the household of origin experience as a result of outmigration? Mainly we focus on the shortage of labor because it is tied to the productivity of the household farm. So what can the household do? People usually adjust the labor to replace the labor lost, and it has been found that the labor supply depends heavily on the gender and age. And Mueller and co-authors found in the context of Ethiopia and Malawi that its migrants' mothers and brothers are the ones who supply the excess labor as a response to outmigration of the children. I'll skip most of the content of this slide, except for the very last point, that it has been found that migration is associated with the changes to the composition of the household. And in households that recently sent out a migrant, they're more likely to attract a new household member. it has not been yet studied for the context of internal migrations that we look at and at the context of Africa. So what do? We investigate how the outmigration of youth from rural households affect the labor supply of the remaining household members, the household composition, the amounts of hired labor and cultivated land. We account for selection into migration using matching, so we use difference and differences and compare the outcomes in the changes to the outcomes in households that sent out a migrant and the changes to the outcomes in similar households that did not send out a migrant. We use the Living Standards Measurement Study data for Tanzania for 2008-2009 and 2012-2013. And our sample consists of households that had at least one young person of age from 15 to 34 in the first survey wave, and at least one non-migrant member remaining in the origin location by the last survey wave. We define migrants based on the distance that people traveled between the survey waves, and our cutoff point is 5 kilometers. So here we compare the migrant youth to the non-migrant youth. We see that migrants are on average younger, there are more women among them, they're less likely to be married and more likely to be the children of the household head. As for their activities, they are more likely to spend some time away from the household at baseline, they're less likely to be farmers, and they're more likely to be at school. The households that send out a migrant tend to be larger, wealthier, and located in more densely populated areas. So overall, migrants are different from non-migrant youth. They spend less time on the household farm, and they also spend less time on other income-generating activities. So we can expect that the migration of these individuals can have a lower impact on the household of origin than outmigration of other young members. Sorry. Zoom showed me something. I hope everything is okay. Please let me know if it isn't. Okay, so here we are looking at the changes to the household level outcomes in households with and without migrant use. We see that although migrants supplied less labor to the farm, there is still shortage of labor. So the total family agricultural labor increases in households without migrants, and it does not change in households with migrants. We also see that there is an increase in the number of new household members of working age. And interestingly, we don't see any changes to the specialization on farming. So even though we see the shortage of labor in households that send out a migrant, we don't see any significant change to the structure of the income. So here are the regression results. We confirm after accounting for selection into migration, we confirm that there is a shortage of labor that is expressed both in terms of the number of workers and the number of days they spend on the farm. We see that there is an increase in the number of new members who supply labor to the household farm, although their labor is not sufficient to cover the shortage of labor that occurred with outmigration. We see that the results for other variables are not significant, and we look not just at a simple indicator of migration, but we also differentiate migrants by their gender, age, and destination. And we further see that if we only look at outmigration of older youth, so people of age from 21 to 34, their outmigration actually positively affects the amount of higher labor use and the land under cultivation, which suggests that the increase in remittances that are sent by these older people are significant enough for the household to invest more in the household farm. So yeah, overall, the household with migrants lose up to 20% of their labor days. So here are the results for the individual labor supply to the farm. We see that children are the least affected, especially girls who do not increase the labor as much as in households without migrants. But people of working age are actually harmed by this, by the outmigration. So we see that women especially are the ones who increase significantly their labor supply to the farm as a result of outmigration. Results for the elderly are also interesting because we see a lower probability for them to exit agriculture, and we also see an increase in the amount of labor spent on the farm. So here we see the results for three groups of people: for women, for rural destined migrants, and for migrants of age from 21 to 34, so older migrants. And compared to the three other cohorts, so for men, for urban destined migrants, and for younger migrants, these people were the ones who supplied more labor to the household farm. And we see that with their out-migration, there is a significant increase in the number of women who spend, women of age from 35 to 64. Thank you. There is a significant increase in the, there is a significant positive impact of youth out-migration on the change to the amount of time they spend on the farm. So there are some other differential effects for some other groups of people. I'll skip this. So for the new household members, we see that they tend to spend, they are less likely to be farmers. They're more likely to be in school and in household maintenance. So these are the numbers for children. So in households with migrants, girls are more likely to be in school and boys are more likely to be in household maintenance or unemployed. Young women are more likely to, again, be students or be unemployed. Young men are more likely to have an off-farm employment, while people of age from 35 to 64 who join these households that recently sent out a migrant are the only ones who supply more labor to the household farm. And this result holds in the regressions as well. So overall, what do we find? We find that migrant youth are more likely to be students. They spend less time on the farm and spend more time away from the household of origin. Yet the household of origin experienced a shortage of labor related to their out-migration. And women of age from 35 to 64 and men of age 65 and older are the ones who start to try to cover for this loss of labor. We find that households that experience that migration are more likely to invite a new household member, but among these new members, only women of age from 35 to 64 provide a higher amount of labor to the farm, yet children and youth spend less time on the farm. That's it. Thank you. I can hardly hear what is happening.
I'm gonna bring the microphone.
Thank you. So that was super interesting. And I think in this context, the migrants were disproportionately women. And you didn't say much about disaggregating between male and female migrants. You talked a lot about those left behind by male and female and by age. But can you say a little bit about any work you might have done on heterogeneity by the gender of the migrant?
Sure. So for all of my regressions are done for men and women, male and female migrants separately, for rural destined and urban destined migrants separately, and for younger and older migrants separately. So, for example, here we can see that these are the effects for out-migration of women. And what I find more frequently is that as women tend to spend more time on the farm prior to migration, their migration has more drastic effect on the outcomes. And okay, I don't have it here, but yeah, the summary is that those who spend more time on the farm and women migrants specifically, they tend to lead to more disturbance if they migrate. Also, sorry, I have another thought of here in this regressions with the number of new household members excluding newborns. So we see in regressions with female migrants that if a woman moves out, then we are less likely to see a newborn in the household. And as I'm looking at the population of migrants who are from age 15 to 34, it makes sense because these are the childbearing age for women.
Thank you very much, Tania, for an interesting presentation. Go and give a round of applause again. Why not?
Thank you.
All right. we're gonna have Avi. Go. Have to share your screen.
Is it sure?
Not yet, 'cause I have to turn it off.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Abhinavan Chakraborty, and when I had submitted this paper, I was a job market candidate from University of New Mexico. I just graduated, and I'm starting as a visiting assistant professor at Colgate University. This was my job market paper on the impact of return migration on schoolwork trade-off and labor outcomes of adolescents. So to give a brief motivation, as we, just in the previous presentation, she talked about migration. This is about return migration when migrants return back to their home country. And return migration is an intrinsic part of the cycle of international migration and development. Now, although there is growing attention towards border protection in recent years, there is sparse research on understanding the impact of return migration on the origin countries. And the focus of my paper is on the US-Mexico corridor, which represents one of the world's largest migration flows in the human history. However, since 2007, there was a reversing trend of more migrants returning back than those moving to the United States. And this is how the trend looked like. In 2007, there was a reversing trend of more migrants returning to Mexico than those moving to the United States. There were approximately 1.39 million people who moved to Mexico from the US between that period. And if we look at the 2010 census, there was 985,000 people. If we compare that to the 2000 census, there was a four-fold increase in the number of return migrants. With that, the research question for my paper, the main research question is that what is the effect of these temporary migration experiences on the human capital and labor outcomes of adolescents in return migrant households? Specifically, does a return migrant in the household affect the schoolwork trade-off and the occupational choices of adolescents in those households specifically? So when a migrant migrates to a different country, their optimal strategy is to maximize their lifetime utility. And with that, they acquire mainly three types of capital. The first is human capital, financial capital, and cultural capital. With respect to human capital, they acquire new skills and knowledge, which is highly rewarding in the origin country when they return back. Financial capital, they acquire savings because wage rates are generally high in the destination countries if you are migrating from a developing to a developed country. And cultural capital, they acquire new social norms from the destination country. And there is evidence in the literature of accumulation of these three capitals. The contribution of my paper are in mainly two strands of literature. The first is the link between return migration and development in the origin countries. With that, I'm trying to find the effect of return migration on human capital and labor outcomes of children using micro-level data. And the other one is the trade-off between child labor and schooling. So when a child goes to work, that may impede the physical and mental development, may cause deterioration of the mental health. When migrant returns back with those accumulation of savings or human capital, whatever they're accumulating from the developed country, they're coming back with those, that may lead to more investment in children's education and knowledge diffusion. Thus, return migration can be a channel which can decrease child labor in developing countries. To do this empirical analysis, the main data set that I have is an individual household level data, which is the 2010 population housing census of Mexico. I have several municipality level characteristics from INAFED and have created an instrument with the use of two main data sets. The first is the Urban Institute State Immigration Policy Resource and Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I'm going to discuss that in my next slide. The main important point of census is that this is a nationally representative sample, and it has retrospective migration information from where I get my main independent variable return migration. The sample that I am considering are age 12 to 19, non-migrant Mexican-born children, and the treatment group will be US return migrant households, and the control group are non-migrant households. And the main difference between these two households will that the US return migrant households will have some migration experience, and the non-migrant households will have no migration experience. I have two main dependent variables. The first is the school work trade-off, which has 4 categories. Only if the adolescent is only attending school, if they're only going to work, neither of the activities, or doing both at the same time. And labor outcomes, again, it has 4 categories: non-participation, self-employed, wage salaried work, or unpaid work. My main independent variable comes from a question from the census, which asked 5 years ago, in what state of the Republic or in which country does the person live? With that, I create my main independent variable, household with a return migrant, which is equals to 1 if there is a return migrant in the household from the United States, and 0 if it's a non-migrant household. And I have several other control characteristics. If we look at the summary statistics, I'm not going into the details of that. We'll find that there is negative selection into return migration. Therefore, a naive comparison between the two groups. So it has been, the table has been divided into 4 columns. The first is for the full sample. The second is for non-migrant household sample. Third is for return migrant household sample. And the fourth is the difference. So there is negative selection into return migrant household samples. A naive comparison between these two households will lead us to biased estimates. And therefore, we are using an instrumental variable approach. The main problem of my independent variable is endogeneity because of 2 reasons mainly. The first is omitted variable bias and reverse causality. And the instrument that I'm using here is immigration enforcement exposure, which is a shift share instrument. It has mainly 2 components. The first is the synthesized policy score of for each state in the United States. And I'm linking this with the share of migrants, that is the lambda. This is the share of migrants from each municipality M in Mexico living across the US states. If I multiply these 2 components, I get my instrument immigration enforcement exposure. Again, I'm not going into the details of how I created, but it's the synthesized policy score is just an average of the 4 policies that were created to identify undocumented immigrants in the United States. And this is how the share of migrant looks like. So if there is a Mexican municipality number 1, and the shares are 0.5 to New Mexico, 0.2 to Texas, and 0.3 to Ohio, if you multiply those with the synthesized policy scores that we have received from each state in the United States, I get some values. And if I add those values, I get my instrument for municipality level 1. My instrument lies from 0 to 1. Closer to 1 means higher exposure of Mexican municipalities to the US immigration enforcement. And it captures each Mexican municipality's exposure to US interior enforcement, in the United States. I use a control function approach because this is a nonlinear setting. My first stage is loaded. My second stage is multinomial loaded. So moving on to the main results, my first stage results show that with higher enforcement or high exposure to enforcement, that leads to there is a higher probability of return migration in the houses living on those municipalities. And moving on to our main results, this is the result for the school work trade-off. I find that having a return migrant in the household increases the probability of school attendance by 25.4 percentage points, decreases the probability of work by 9.8 percentage points, and doing both activities, that the probability decreases by 11.5 percentage points. And these effects are greater for male samples compared to female samples. If I look at occupational choices, again, for having a return migrant in the household, there is a higher probability of non-participation for adolescents in those households. Self-employment increases, wage salary decreases, and unpaid work decreases. I also do some heterogeneity analysis with respect to age and by wealth. I find that all the effects that I found are increasing as you move towards older adolescents. And this is intuitive because as you move to older adolescents, the probability of transition from school to work increases. So that is the time when having a return migrant in the household is having a greater effect on school and as well as for work. If we look at by wealth, my wealth is my wealth. I've created a wealth index using a principal component analysis method. It lies from -8 to 8, 8 being wealthy households, -8 means poor households. And these effects are, all of these effects are greater towards the poorer households. So having a return migrant in the household has a greater effect for the poor households. And this also is intuitive because that means that all the savings that they're accumulating and bringing back, that leads to positive effects of school attendance and as well as decreasing effect of work. There are several robustness analyses that I do, that is with omitting rural households, without high migration states, without domestic return migration households, without northwest states, and without border states. All of these are mostly robust to omitting. There are also some sensitivity analysis that I do because I define my adolescent group from 12 to 19. Here I've defined from 12 to 18. I've divided the sample from 12 to 15 and 16 to 19, where I find that the effects are greater towards, again, towards the older adolescents in this case. The other analysis that I do is with older siblings and younger siblings, because when a migrant migrates to a different country, all of the burden is on the younger, on the older sibling. So therefore, I find that when a migrant returns back to the household, all of these effects are greater for the older siblings because so the migrant has returned back with those experiences, and the older sibling can go to school and does not have to go to work at that point of time. So to conclude, with the accumulated savings of financial capital, the probability of wage increase when a migrant returns back home, occupational mobility that may lead to increase in income, and all of these three may relax income constraints in the households, leading to pulling children out of the labor force and investing in their human capital accumulation. So I explore the causal relationship between return migration and children's school work trade-off and occupational choices. So the stream of migrants returning to the hometowns in Mexico have contributed to increase in probability of school attendance, decrease in probability of work, and decrease in probability of both activities. For occupational choice, I find there is increase in non-participation, increasing probability of self-employment, and decreasing wage-side work and unpaid work. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, so our next presenter will be Robel Alemu. I'm going to make you a co-host so you can share your screen. Should be. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Robel Alemu. I was a job market candidate at Tufts University. Now I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at UCLA. This was my job market paper. It's on micronutrients, child health, and academic achievement, by specifically looking at evidence from iodized salt access disruption in Ethiopia. So as many of you may know, iodine is a key component of the thyroid hormone, which plays an important role in regulating a wide range of biochemical processes, specifically tied to development and function of different organs and organ systems, especially the brain. So when iodine is missing from our diet, it mainly impairs the thyroid hormone function. And this has a big impact, especially during the development of the brain, which happens during gestation and during infancy. So the most damaging impact, according to the WHO, of iodine deficiency is irreversible cognitive impairment. And in case of severe iodine deficiency, which happens during childhood and adolescence, it's been tied to intellectual disability. And in severe cases, it results in goiter, which is the most severe manifestation of iodine deficiency. The main source of iodine in our biosphere is the ocean, but most places in the world, including Ethiopia, which is the focus of my study, are located really far away from the marine environment. So these places rely on environmentally available iodine. So that means iodine that goes from the soil to the grain and then ends up in people's diet. But the iodine's role in plants is highly limited. So the transmission efficiency of iodine from soils to grains to humans is really low. If people have to rely on diet that's derived just from grains, they will not be able to meet the recommended dietary allowance. So if you specifically look at during pregnancy and lactation, which is the most sensitive period, high demand, you see that a mother would only meet only 6% of the recommended dietary allowance. When if a mother entirely relies on food that's brought from grain. But if you think of salt, iodized salt, which is the primary source of iodine, just 20 to 40 milligrams, a tablespoon of iodized salt would meet the daily requirements. But what happens when this important source of iodine misses from our diet? So unfortunately, that's what happened in Ethiopia in the late 1990s, when war broke between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and the access to iodized salt was disrupted for Ethiopia because the blending facility was located in neighboring country Eritrea. So following that, the supply of iodine really plummeted and prices soared drastically. This drastically reduced the iodized salt use. As you can see here, following the war, by 2000, it was only about 30% of the population. And by 2005, it was as low as 4% of the entire population. And these was the lowest in the entire world. And by this period, the National Micronutrient Survey indicated that 40% of children were suffering from goiter, and over 35% of their mothers were also suffering from goiter. So things took quite long to recover. So this study first looks at the spatial distribution of ecologically available iodine, what's available in the soils and grains, and try to understand the transmission of iodine in the soil, grain, and human continuum. And then most importantly, I'm interested to look at the impacts of early life loss of iodized salt on children's survival, on their physical health by looking at birth weight and anthropometry, and eventually interested into understand the impacts on academic achievement at the end of high school. So for these, I use as a proxy for cognitive performance, I use the Ethiopian Higher Education Entrance Examination, where students sit for at the end of grade 12. And these are different subjects. I look at test scores, which are out of 700. And these are transformed into z-scores for ease of interpretation of results. And these are linked to exposures at the district level. So I this is by far a really large data set. So I have data for over 2 million students who sat for the exam between 2003 and 2019. And after excluding certain students, I have a little over 1 million students as an estimation sample, and these are subdivided into different cohorts based on exposure. So those born within a year of the war, within 2 years of the war, and within 3 years of the war. For childhood health and survival indicators, I use the demographic and health surveys data. This is a national representative cross-sectional data. I use 2 waves, 2000 and 2005, and look at birth weight and childhood growth indicators, looking at attained height and weight, and children's survival. The empirical strategy I use is the standard differences and differences strategy by exploiting 2 sources of variation. One is the temporal shock, which is the war, and the other is the spatial variation in environmental iodine. I define treatment, which is basically the exposure to soil iodine exposure, in 2 ways. One is the continuous measure, which is the district level average soil iodine. And the other one is a binary indicator, whether a child lived in the highest versus lowest quartile of soil iodine distribution. I defined 3 birth cohorts as indicated earlier. So this is the specification of the difference in differences model. I have 2 types. One is the dose response difference in differences. In this case, I use a log transformed variable for soil iodine concentration, interacted with an indicator variable whether a child was born before or after the war. And the other model is the discrete difference in differences. So in this case, I replaced the continuous measure of exposure by an indicator variable whether a child was born in the highest versus lowest soil iodine concentration, interacted with the post indicator. And I control for birth year fixed effects, district fixed effects, and run robust OLS models, clustering the standard errors at the district level. So this is the visual representation of the DID estimator. So it's the average differences in the outcome between those born, those who resided in the treatment versus the comparison district net of the pre-war trend. So as you can see here, so on average, children were around 2 years of age when they were observed in the demographic and health surveys. And when they sat for the national examinations, they were around 19 years of age. So I find that the disruption, so I divide the analysis by looking at children who were raised and grew up in rural areas to look at the impacts, and also as a placebo test, I look at effects in urban areas as well. So the disruption led to a lower test score, and these effects were less severe in iodine-rich areas and were more pronounced 2 years after the war. So as you can see here, these are different cohorts of students, so those born within a year of the war. So in the first column, as you can see here, the war did actually disrupted the lowered test scores of students, but most importantly, the coefficient of interest, which is the interaction between post and the measure of exposure, which is log transformed soil iodine concentration. As you can see here, each percent increase in district level soil iodine concentration sort of shielded students from being impacted negatively by the disruption of the war. And the effects are much higher for those born within 2 years and within 3 years of the war. But as you can see in the last 3 columns, these effects were not observed in urban areas because the link between soil iodine exposure and what ends up in people's diet is directly tied to crop production. So given that there is no crop production in urban areas, you don't see that soil iodine concentration is impacting.
You have 1 minute, bro.
Okay. Let me jump to, So this is the visual depiction of the results. So there is, as you can see, the panel in the left is showing that there is clear evidence of a dose response effect. So the effects were more pronounced at the lowest soil iodine level, especially in iodine deficient areas. You see that children score much lower if they were born just after the war versus those born pre-war. But I ran similar analysis using selenium instead of iodine. As you can see here, there is no gradient in terms of the effects of the disruption for those born pre and post-war, providing a strong evidence that the effects are indeed because of iodine. I do also find effects on survival. So against, there is a mortality selection against those born after the war and among those who grew up in iodine deficient area. So there is no detectable effect on birth weight in anthropometry.
As I'm gonna have to cut you
Sure.
off, so because we
Sure.
just finishing. So just make sure you have time for a question, okay?
Sure.
Even though I've done research on iodine in Ethiopia, so this is probably the presentation most up my alley. So I want to make sure we have time for questions. Any questions? Okay, I will. Go ahead.
Things to think about just for the sake of time. But just two of the things that, or a few of the things that I kind of thought about, and I'm sure you've thought about these things too, and it's just a 10-minute presentation. And so there's only so much you can present. But one, like, since you're looking at, sorry, I feel like I'm giving feedback. Since you're looking at your sample is those who are taking their, like, the secondary school exam. And so there is also, like, not just a mortality selection, but there's kind of a sample selection in the fact that, like, your sample is those who make it all the way through secondary school. And so kind of thoughts about how that affects how we interpret these findings. And then I also, and then just two other quick things, like I concern about like endogenous in the endogeneity and the spatial variation of iodine in the soil. One of my friends, Leah Bevis, she's done a lot of work on nutrients in soil. And I know that she finds like that there really is important like spatial trends that are related to where like you have nutrient rich soils versus not. And then the last thing is with your placebo test that I would ask is just like, how much variation is there in iodine soil across urban areas, right? So could it be that like you're getting a null effect because there's just not a lot of iodine variation? And so those are my three questions. I don't know if there's time to answer them, but if they're the ones that I would ask in a full session. But good job. This is like very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, and Rob, if you want to take a minute to try to
answer. Sure. Thank you so much for the questions and feedback. Really on point. So let me just like highlight your first question of selection bias. So that's exactly what we detect. I look at impact on survival. So as you can see here, so those born after the disruption of iodine salt and those who grew up in iodine deficient areas disproportionately suffer from higher mortality, like starting from the onset, like from birth up to age 5 relative to other groups. So as you indicated, definitely those who sit for these national exams are the ones who end up surviving and also make it to this school. So the argument is that the effects that I detect are lower bounds. So those that are severely impacted and do not make it to grade 12 will be highly impacted. So the effect that I detect are likely lower bounds.
Our next presenter is going to be Abu Bakr.
Can you let me share my screen?
You have the power now.
Thank you. I believe you can see my screen.
We can.
Awesome. I'll get going. So hi everyone. This is Abu Bakr. I was a PhD candidate at Michigan State University this year. My dissertation revolves around the themes of crime, conflict, and violence. And this particular paper, my job market paper, is about, it combines burned agricultural biomass coming from fields, its impact on air pollution, and hence the impact of air pollution on crime. So we know air pollution is known to affect health outcomes such as mortality and lung disease and heart diseases. There's other research that talks about its impacts on cognition and behavior. So for example, children score low on test scores in high air pollution settings, and baseball umpires make more mistakes in higher air pollution settings. But can crime be a social cost of air pollution? And there is plethora of literature, I want to say sufficient literature, that establishes the impact of other environmental factors on crime, such as temperature and precipitation. But with air pollution, you have this added dimension that air pollution has a psychological impact on a human being through, so for example, it reduces serotonin levels in your body, which have been known to increase the tendency to be aggressive. So there is some literature, a couple of papers to be more precise, that find a causal relationship between air pollution and crime. One is based on air pollution levels in Chicago. The other is based on air pollution levels in London. There's nothing that looks at a setting that is broader than just a metropolitan city, and there's nothing that looks at a setting in a developing country setting. So this is what I do. Additionally, anthropogenic pollution is a form of burned agricultural biomass, and it's often overlooked. 25% of burned agricultural biomass comes from rice fields. Burned agricultural biomass is produced by, I want to say, wildfires as well. And as we know, wildfires have been in large quantities recently. Burned agricultural biomass from fields is about 40% as much as that comes from wildfire. So it's huge in quantity. It's just that it's more scattered, so it's not looked as that much of an important source. These fires are mostly intended to clear crop residues. The socioeconomic costs of these fires are not well understood. But moving on, in this paper, I analyzed the impact of air pollution on violent and non-violent crimes in Punjab province of Pakistan. Over there, what's happening is that farmers are clearing their rice farmers in particular, clearing their fields by burning the stubble. I'll briefly explain to you why. But I leverage that burned agricultural biomass from rice stubble burning as an exogenous source of variation in air pollution. More importantly, and I'll focus more on that, I provide empirical evidence on mechanisms that can link this seemingly elusive relation between air pollution and crime. The other two papers speculate on it and provide some suggestive evidence, but I try to make a more hard empirical attempt at providing some evidence on at least one potential mechanism. So a little bit of a background. Pakistan's Punjab province, it shares the border with India's Punjab province. It has faced exponential increase in air pollution and smog recently, particularly since 2015. During the winter season, FAO, in collaboration with the Punjab province government, did a report on it, a comprehensive report on it, and found that a major reason for this is the increasingly common practice of rice stubble burning. So rice in this part of the world is planted in May and June, and it's harvested in September and October. We have two cropping seasons mostly in South Asia, and the other one begins in January, for which cotton happens to be the more popular crop in Punjab. But from between October and December, farmers typically burn the stubble to get their fields ready for the next cropping season. There are various reasons for that. I will not discuss them given the time constraints. One major reason is that farmers recently, 80% of the farmers in FAO's surveys reported that they have adopted or increased the use of combine harvesters, which just leaves more stubble to be burnt. And obviously, farmers find that burning the stubble is perhaps the most cost-effective way for them to get rid of the stubble. Over here, I have fires, number of annual fires planted. This comes from a NASA data, which gives you the number of active fires every day. So total number of active fires in the burning season, which is October through December, and then total number of fires in the rest of the year. 2008 just happens to be an abnormal year, but if you see through the rest of the graphs, post 2015, you can see an exponential increase in the number of fires being burnt in the burning season. While for the rest of the season, the number of fires on average relatively do not show any such pattern. But how does this lead to an increased air pollution? And this really is what the context is. The wind in the post-monsoon months of October and November blows towards the north and northwest. As I'll show you, all the rice growing districts, 11 out of 36 districts in Punjab are the major rice growers. They're all located towards the east. And when wind blows towards the north and northwest, it essentially carries all that smoke or whatever air pollution, particles there are to essentially the rest of the districts in the Punjab province. Then later in early winter, a high localized air pressure builds up, which is technically a dry season, which traps in smoke and other particles in the air, leading to the formation of smog. This prevails up until the end of winter in February, when some winds from the west bring in some rainfall and relieve the area from high air pollution levels. So this is where we have most of the rice growing districts in green. And as you can see, if the wind blows toward the north and northwest, most of the province gets engulfed in very high smog or air pollution levels. I combined different sources of data here. I'm not going to talk about them in detail until I'm asked later in question. The crime data is annual. It's unfortunately not seasonal in nature. I have data on 14 different types of crime in each district. So it's like murder, assault, theft, things like that. That's the most granular I could go. My main explanatory variable is aerosol optical depth, which has been used as a measure of air pollution. I use it here because smoke is a major component of aerosol optical depth. So my main empirical strategy is log of crimes in district J in GRT, normalized by district population. And my main explanatory variable here is aerosol optical depth in the 4 winter months of November, December, January, and February, when we have very high air pollution or smog levels. I have district fixed effects, GR fixed effects. There's an administrative level above district. It's called division. 36 districts are into 7 divisions. So I have division specific time frames as well. And I have a host of other controls, which include temperature, precipitation, and other socioeconomic controls that are taken from repeated cross sections.
4 minutes, Abu Bakr.
Sure. So air pollution and crime can have, there's an endogeneity problem here, right? Because you can have high economic activity going on in an area that can lead to higher air pollution, but high economic activity is basically increasing employment, which technically should reduce the crime rate. So to deal with that, I construct an instrument. Most instruments in this type of literature come from wind direction or wind speed. That's what I do. So I have the average annual wind direction from those 12 rice growing districts during the month of October, November, and December. Next, I calculate something called azimuth from the rice growing districts to east district. So what is azimuth? Azimuth is the direction from one district to another. So the azimuth from New York to Chicago, I believe, is about 91 degrees, if I can remember correctly. I subtract that, and the absolute difference tells me how upwind or downwind a district is at. So if that absolute difference is 0, you are the most exposed to that air pollution. As the difference increases from 0 on either side, you are less and less exposed. So that's how I construct my instrument. Here I have my first stage results. As expected, the relationship of air pollution with that instrument is negative, because if that difference is 0, you are the most exposed. The first stage F-stat is a pretty healthy one. To argue exogeneity, I would just say that it's easier to argue with wind direction or wind speed, and that's why it's very common to use them in this kind of literature. Because wind direction or wind speed are determined not by socioeconomic activity levels or my outcome of interest, but rather by what's happening in the upper atmosphere. I have my results sitting in the appendix section due to time constraints, but I'll just like to say here that the effect on violent crime prevails is, first, the effect on violent crime is higher, and it's robust to different specification changes, and it prevails for another year compared to the effect on non-violent crimes. And this result is basically in line with psychological literature, right, which tells you that basically air pollution can increase your tendency to be violent. But my effect sizes are much larger than in literature. So for example, the paper on Chicago, it finds that a 1 standard deviation increase in air pollution leads to about a 3% increase in violent crime. I find about a 15 to 21% point increase in violent crime, which I guess is here is because we have very high levels of air pollution. So even this in 2021 in November, they closed down schools and courts for some part of November. And PM 2.5 is one measure of air pollution. With that, on some days they crossed 350 on some days in November. I don't think they ever even crossed 100 in Chicago. So that gives you an idea of the extent of air pollution I'm considering here. I have various robustness checks. I'll skip through them in the interest of time. I want to talk more about my mechanisms in the remaining section because that's an important part. If air pollution leads to labor market shocks, it can be an important channel linking crime and air pollution because we know that labor market shocks do have an impact on air pollution. Now forget this slide for a moment and consider my scenario. I have a scenario of a developing country where 70% of the labor force tends to be male. Additionally, air pollution is likely to affect the productivity levels of older male individuals. In that case, if older male individuals are more affected in their labor market outcomes, then they might be the ones who are involved in crime. So I present that result here, and I have some socioeconomic data from different cross sections for these 17 years. And I saw that one standard deviation increase in air pollution reduces the income levels for the older male individuals, but does not do so for the younger male individuals. Additionally, this impact is not driven by seasonal labor market shocks, which that result I do not have here. But to conclude, marginal social costs of air pollution, the externalities associated with air pollution are higher than those previously considered. More importantly, curbing air pollution levels can help reduce crime. And that's, I want to say, that's an important result here because developing countries do not have the resources needed to patrol, to increase patrolling at times. They do not have very strong institutions to help fight crime. This can also help ensure that investment is not crowded out of places where you have very high, you can potentially have high levels of crime. The other important conclusion I want to focus on here is that agriculture tends to be the most important sector in a lot of developing countries. It has a higher proportion in GDP and it employs a lot higher proportion of the labor force as well. So you can't just give away rice production in this case. It's the second highest foreign exchange earner for Pakistan as well. So you have to come up with more sustainable practices and provide incentives to the farmers that talk about that that help them come up with alternative ways of getting rid of their stubble. I discuss some costs associated with the increase in crime coming just from higher air pollution levels. I'll discuss them in the questions someone asked me, but they give me an idea of how much you can spend on a subsidy that can be provided to farmers. So
Right,
thank you,
stop
and I'm
there,
open to any questions.
So we can have time for a question. Thank you, Abu Bakr. Questions? Go ahead. You might have to come up. Thanks.
Hello. I don't remember. Do you have calendar month fixed effects in your model? My question will depend on whether that's a yes or no.
No, I do not have calendar fixed effects, but I do have other robustness checks.
Yeah, because I was wondering if it's possible that, I don't know the context very well, but is it possible that in those months where there's also higher pollution, people are not working in the field so much, they like do other maybe that like they don't have that that to keep them busy and they resort to crime. I don't know if that's yeah, I mean, yeah.
Okay, so to answer that, I'll answer that. I answer that in my paper in a couple of ways. First, the number of months I consider, I vary them, and my result is robust to that change. The other is in my mechanisms, I look at if unemployment is being driven by higher air pollution, because if it is, then my result of my mechanism that lower incomes are driving this is basically contaminated. But I show that higher air pollution in this case is not causing any significant changes in unemployment levels. Additionally, I do know that most of this part is rural, and I know that there are two cropping seasons. So one ends in September, the other starts in January, and I have January and February in my months for which I consider air pollution. So that's when potentially you'll have higher employment levels rather than lower employment levels.
Thank you. Presentation.
Any other questions?
Maybe, but we don't have to.
Okay.
Lightning session.
Okay, I'll stop
It's
sharing.
surprising to me actually that there isn't a relationship between unemployment.
I guess because
Share your screen, by the way.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I guess it's because that relationship with unemployment is not there because this air pollution is more of a seasonal phenomenon.
especially given the levels. Okay, thank you very much.
Mhm.
We are going to.
Thank you.
let's see. You can find it.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Kritika Sen Chakraborty, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of Economics, University of New Mexico. And I'm going to talk about my job market paper on which I'm working with my advisor, Dr. Kira Villa. And this is on the effects of cash transfers on adolescent nutrition outcomes in the context of the Child Support Grant in South Africa. As has been well documented, there's a double burden of malnutrition in South Africa, which means there's a prevalence of underweight and obesity among children as well as adolescents. And between 2000 and 2016, there has been a tremendous increase in rates of obesity among boys and girls. And while rates of severe underweight have decreased in this time period, the rates are still quite alarming. Approximately 5.9% among boys and 2.5% among girls. So the aim of this paper is to examine the effect of a large welfare program, which is the Child Support Grant, on the nutrition outcomes of adolescents based on body mass index or BMI for age Z-scores and its categories: underweight, normal, overweight, and obese. So a little bit of background on the Child Support Grant. This is one of the largest welfare programs in South Africa, which is targeted at poorer children. It was introduced in 1998, and it is a means-tested grant provided to age-eligible poor children in South Africa. And so the monthly grant is provided to the primary caregiver on behalf of each beneficiary child up to a maximum of 6 children per caregiver. And the grant terminates at the end of the month in which the child crosses the age threshold. So this table shows us the time periods in which reforms with respect to changes in the age eligibility were implemented. The main survey time period that I consider for this study is from 2008 to 12, during which there were changes in the age eligibility criterion, which means, and the age eligibility criterion was extended from 14 to 18 years in increments of 1 every year, which means the same set of cohorts were now eligible for extended periods of time for the grant. And so our study exploits this as the exogenous source of cross-birth cohort variation in the receipt of the grant. Now, along with changes in age eligibility criterion, there were some changes in the means test amount as well as the grant amount, but these were mainly done to account for inflation. So the data that I used for this study is from the National Income Dynamics Study, which is available for the periods starting from 2008 to 2017. For this study, we used the first 3 waves, that is 2008, 10, and 12. And my sample comprises of adolescents aged 11 to 19 in every survey. The outcome variables that we use for this study are body mass index or BMI for age Z-scores. For those who are not very familiar, these are one of the most commonly used indicators of weight relative to height. And BMI Z-scores are standardized measures of BMI given a child's age and sex. Based on the BMI Z-scores, we create 4 categories of nutritional status. Underweight if BMI Z-score is less than -2 standard deviations relative to the median of the reference population based on the WHO growth standards. Normal if the BMI Z-score lies between -2 and 1 standard deviation. overweight if the BMI-Z score is above 1 and between and less than 2, and obese if the BMI-Z score is above 2 standard deviations. So when we look at females and males, this is how the density of BMI-Z scores look like. Now, if you look at males, the density plots for the grant recipients and non-recipients are pretty coinciding. But if you look at females, we see that there are distinct differences between those who received and those who didn't receive the grant. But because of selection issues and of course endogeneity, these do not represent the causal effects of the child support grant. Now, to estimate the causal effects of this grant receipt, we use a fuzzy regression discontinuity design, which exploits the exogenous change generated by extension of age eligibility. And since this is equivalent to an IV world estimator, I use an instrumental variable approach. So in the first stage, CSG or the grant receipt is a function of whether the adolescent is eligible at the time of the survey or not, based on the age eligibility criteria. And then we also control for polynomials based on the running variable, which is the centered running variable. So the running variable is defined as age relative to the eligibility criteria. And we also control for household and community characteristics and time-fixed effects. So for the continuous BMI-Z scores, we use a simple 2SLS approach. But for the nutritional status categories, we use a multinomial logit approach using a control function framework. And in this framework, the probability of being in either of these states is defined by this particular formula, where V represents the indirect utility from being in a particular nutritional status. And this is a function of the child support grant and the set of controls. So just a graphical representation. So this plot shows the probability of receiving the grant on either side of the age eligibility cutoff in every period. And so this actually demonstrates the fuzzy nature of this research design. And so those on the left are the ones who gained eligibility, those are on the right are ones who lost eligibility to the grant. And so a little bit of graphical depiction of the reduced form results. So we see that among females, those who are eligible are likely to have higher BMI-Z scores relative to those who are not eligible. Among males, we don't find any discontinuity. When we look at underweight, again, females who are eligible are less likely to be underweight. Males, we don't find any such effects. We don't find any effects on the probability of being in a normal category, whether for females or males. When we look at overweight, we do find that females who are eligible are more likely to be overweight relative to those who are not eligible. And then finally, when we look at the obese category, we see that females who are eligible are less likely to be obese relative to those who are not eligible. And so now let's go back to the instrumental regression framework. And so this is the result from the first stage, where we see that those who are eligible are, of course, more likely to receive the grant. And this table presents the main results from our paper, where in the first row we see for BMI-Z scores, females who are grant beneficiaries are likely to have higher BMI-Z scores of about 0.33 standard deviations relative to the control group. And when we look at the nutritional status categories, we see that females who are beneficiaries are less likely to be underweight by about 7 percentage points. They're more likely to be overweight by about 12.2 percentage points and less likely to be obese by 6.4 percentage points. So we see that grant receipt, it alleviates extreme forms of malnutrition, but it can also increase the probability of being overweight, and hence it can increase the health risks associated with being overweight among females. Now, we also do some quantile regressions to see the effects at different points in the distribution of BMI-Z scores. Among females, we see that The marginal effects are positive for quantiles up to the 60th percentile, whereas among males, we see that all the positive effects are only at the extreme lowest end of the BMI-Z distribution. And so the validity of estimates from RD design are based on continuity assumptions. And so we do all of the normal RD checks, which are based on continuity in baseline socioeconomic characteristics, continuity in the density of the running variable, and all of these hold. And then we do a couple of sensitivity checks to different specifications using different polynomials of the running variable. Placebo tests are different cutoffs, as well as using data-driven bandwidths using methods followed by Kolonenko, Cataneo, and Turton. And so why do we find effects for female adolescents and no effects for male adolescents? And so based on the data that is available, we use a couple of measures of food consumption and the share of different nutrients, or the share of different food groups in the total food expenditure, as well as the probability of teenage childbearing to see which of the mechanisms work. So we see that female beneficiaries are likely to have higher food expenditures per capita, whereas we don't find such effects for males. And then among the share of different food groups in total food expenditure, we find that in female households, there is a decrease in the share of carbohydrate-rich food in total food expenditure. And also female beneficiaries are less likely to be teen mothers relative to the control group. So these are some of the plausible mechanisms which might be driving the effects of the grant receipt on the nutritional status. And we also find that none of these effects are significant for males. And so to conclude, the child support grant receipt increases BMI-Z scores among female beneficiaries, but whether this is an improvement in health or not, it depends on the effects for whether the grant prevents females from being at the extreme ends of the distribution or not. So we find that cash transfers do improve nutrition because they prevent females from being at extreme ends, but they might also increase health risks associated with being overweight. But this also has implications for improvement in the reproductive health for these adolescent girls. And it is likely to reduce the burden of healthcare costs associated with being undernourished or overnourished. Thank you. Any questions?
So the last section, the child care.
Yes.
Actually, I don't know if that was like a dummy or. Was this 12%?
So it is the change in the probability of being a teenage mother or teenage pregnancy.
From receipt.
Yes. Yes.
So that's really big. It's almost a wondering, are you able to body weight knowing if the pregnant or not?
Yes. So yeah. Right. Yeah, that's a good question. And so I have tried different specifications with, including the ones who are pregnant at the time of the survey and those who are, and excluding them. So the results are pretty much unchanged, whether I include them or not. And so this variable is, I'm sorry, I didn't clarify it earlier. So this is based on whether the adolescent female has ever given birth to a child. So it might be in the previous period as well. Any questions?
I'm not very familiar with relative health risks.
Okay, yeah, thank you for your question. So in this particular population of South African female adolescents, we see that, okay, I can show you the summary statistics also if you want. So there are the rates of underweight are about 3.5% on an average, whereas rates of obesity are about somewhere around 8%. Now, this is relative to the nutritional the BMI distribution of the reference population as per WHO. And so we find that there's both a burden of underweight, undernutrition, as well as overnutrition among females. And these also have high implications for adult morbidity, because and this kind of a study is really, it's very different from the ones conducted in developed countries, where they're mostly concerned with whether such cash transfers can lead to a decrease in obesity or not. They're really not concerned about underweight outcomes. But here, in this context, because of this double burden of malnutrition, this becomes even a more complicated issue about whether cash transfers are actually improving or whether they're hampering the health of female adolescents.
Close session by thanking everyone for their participation. Thought it was actually the paper. So really impressive that to host this and same go forward. So thank you all in Zoomland, and thank you for your participation. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.